Hi and welcome. Today we're going to begin talking about storyboards. Now, storyboards in iOS are a kind of a big subject, but it all really boils down to whether you're going to use a nib file setting in your application or a storyboard setting in your application. It's really the same thing. Storyboards contain an XML file, or written in an XML file, that will be compiled into your code to form the views that the view controllers will access. So that's really what these nib files are as well. The thing with storyboards is that they allow you to do a couple of things. They allow you to forget about some of those view details and view controller details when you're designing your application, so that you can concentrate on the model side of the application. So let's look at them. Storyboards were added to iOS in version 5 of the operating system and added to Xcode in version 4. Many views and view controllers are presented in one storyboard, and it also shows how they relate to one another, and we can see all of this at once. Unlike zip files, where we can really only see one view and its view controller at a time. However, the view controller behind a storyboard view is still called Files Owner, and we still wire it to a class the same way. We still wire its view to that view, and so on and so forth. Storyboard files are compiled by the compiler into the application. However, with a storyboard, there's no need in our app delegate to override application did finish launching with options, because the storyboard will also compile that into the application instance. So many details of application design with storyboards are hidden from the developer. When we create when we want to create an application with storyboards, it's very simple. There's a checkbox when we create the application. It is the Use Storyboards checkbox. When we name the application, that checkbox comes up, and we can check it to use storyboards. If we leave it unchecked, it will use nib files. We set up the storyboards in Interface Builder, similar to the way we set up nib files. And then views and view controllers, rather than having an action method on one view that instantiates and displays another view controller's view, in a storyboard, we drag a segue from a control on one view to another view. So that's how we connect views and view controllers to one another in a segue. In order to create a segue, we control, click, and drag, and that will create a storyboard segue. It will then ask you whether you want to create a push segue or a modal segue, a custom segue, some kind of relationship. So you get a menu, and we're going to see this in our storyboard demo very clearly. It's much more simple to show than to talk about. So some considerations when working with storyboards. The compiler is going to write code, and that code will instantiate views and their view controllers as late as possible, and this happens during the segue. It usually means that a view controller and its views will be created at the time the segue that displays it is activated. We don't write an action method to back a segue. Those action methods will be compiled for us in code. There is one exception to this, and we'll get to that in the demo. But for the most part, we don't write action methods to back segues. If we control drag a segue from a control on one view controller to another view controller, that segue will just work. We can perform actions, but we can perform actions when the segue is fired. And to do that, we use delegate methods such as the one I have here, prepare for segue sender. The argument to segue is actually the storyboard segue, and sender is the control that fires the segue, usually a button or a bar button item or something like that. We can also make a segue fire in code using the delegate methods of the view controller. So a storyboard view controller has these delegate methods that allow us to prepare for segues and also to execute segues when we want to do that. If your app contains more than one segue, give every single segue a unique identifier. And we do that in the Attributes Inspector with the segue selected in Interface Builder, and we get this simple menu, Storyboard Segue. And in the identifier box, we type whatever we want to use as the segue. This will be an NS string that will be actually a property called segue.identifier. So when we get to prepare for segue sender, that segue, which is the segue parameter of prepare for segue, will have a property called identifier. And then that identifier is an NS string that corresponds to whatever we type in this box. That way we can uniquely define the segue. If we only have one segue, it's not strictly necessary, but we should still give each segue a unique identifier. Get into the habit of creating an identifier for every segue. If we have more than one segue, we can quickly see why this wouldn't be necessary. We need to distinguish which segue on that view controller is being executed. So we check and see which identifier this particular segue has. So that's it in a nutshell. View the demo, and it's much simpler, as I said, to understand how these storyboards work by looking at examples and playing with them yourself. Thank you very much.